First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. I want to open up with a brief story. Years ago, my dad and I were on a train riding from Santa Barbara, California to San Diego. And the train was running ahead of schedule, but we had to stop because there was a freight train coming the other direction. Everyone was getting pissed and irritated because they wanted to get back home on time. And so the conductor got on the loudspeaker and he sort of explained the situation. He said, well, here's the deal. We can wait for the freight train to pass by and get in San Diego a few minutes late, or we can take off now and be on CNN tonight. So everybody laughed and everybody relaxed. And basically that lesson for me was really the importance of context. Is when someone sort of lays out a situation about what your alternatives are, which aren't so bad as what you thought your current situation was, or if they lay out your current situation relative to history or relative to some other piece of information that you weren't aware of, what your options are, sometimes it just gives you some additional insight. It gives you some information. It gives you a framework, which is really important in our business. So I run a forestry research shop called FORISK, and our clients are folks that own manufacturing facilities. They use a lot of wood, so sawmills and pulp mills, pellet plants, or they own and manage a lot of timberland, mostly in the United States. And we have clients in the room, and we appreciate that support. We have a good research relationship. And the kinds of questions that we get from clients really relate to risk. And so I want to tie that to some of the things that we've heard earlier today, because one of the big questions we always get when we conduct an analysis or do a projection is, how sure are you? All right, we've done this work, but how sure are you this is the way it is? So years ago when I came out of school, one of my first job interviews was with Weyerhaeuser, which is where I started my career on the West Coast. And I had a job interview with a guy named Hal Cogburn. He was the controller out in Twin Harbors, Washington, a very rural area. It's right on the coast. There's a big log export facility. And he said, Brookes, okay, you're coming out of school, you're pretty green. If you were to eventually be a manager, how often do you need to be right to be a successful manager? And so I'm thinking right away, I'm going right to the nuts and bolts. I'm thinking, well, shoot, I got employees. So if I got a safety issue, if I've got an ethics issue, if I've got a legal issue, I got to be right 99% of the time. And he said, well, you know, on those topics, you're right. He said, but in business, you need to be right 51% of the time. He said, because as a manager, your job is to be right better than a coin flip. And so the lesson for me in that was that question of how sure are you is a question of context. What's the objective? What's the time frame? What's at stake? And when you think about those things, and then you think about the importance of having a good understanding of the data and stuff you're looking at, you understand that having some context and having a framework and having a way to at least get yourself grounded before making a big decision is really important. So I want to share a few examples for some of our work that's related to this and also ties to some of the forest supply issues that we're talking about today. It's so hard when we analyze markets to get a good understanding of what's happening in the forest products industry. You don't really know what housing is going to do. You don't really know what interest rates are going to do. You don't know what's going to happen with foreign currency and jobs and all those kinds of things. But there are certain things that you can know. And so my theme is really the importance of understanding the physical facts on the ground. It's the importance of knowing what's knowable. It's the importance of laying your eyes on the things that you can really confirm and then provide framework and sideboards before you make a decision, regardless of what the modeling exercise is. Because when someone asks us a question like, what are housing starts going to do? I think that's the wrong question. That's a question that we really can't answer. If there's anything we know for sure is if we produce a forecast of the economy, it's wrong before you hit enter, right? We don't know. We are wrong. You have to provide a projection just to have a baseline understanding of what's going on. And we saw those kinds of projections today, right? You're using the best information you have today to provide projections. And what do? It's the exact same thing we do in our work. To get a better understanding of what's possible, the real question is, what's my situation if housing does this? And what's my situation if housing does Y? And what's my situation if China does this? And what's my situation if there's a tariff? And if there's not a tariff? And so we're all building scenarios, right? We're all doing sort of tactical plans. We're all doing scenarios to test the implications of different things. And we do it for everything, right? You do it for when you go house hunting, and when you apply to college, you have plan A and plan B, and when everything we do has these different scenarios. And so when we think about it is, when we're going to build these scenarios, the one thing that we absolutely have to get right is our understanding of how things work today. So when we look at the forest industry markets, here's some ways that we apply that kind of understanding, because we spend a lot of our time, we've got a small shop. We've got half a dozen people. 5 of us are researchers. Everybody in our team has an experience in the industry, like they've been in the field. They know what a chainsaw is. We know what a cut-down machine is. We can have that conversation. I've got a wood pen that I carry around, and our newest guy just started in January, and he's a Warnell grad. Some of you know him, Justin Tyson. And one of the first days I walked into his office and I gave him the pen. I said, "What kind of wood is it?" And he named off the 3 woods, right? So people in our shop, we just know how things work. That's the sort of where our pride sits, is really laying our eyes on things and knowing what we're looking at. And so we do that to data as well. If we don't really understand something, we share that with others and we say, we don't really understand this. This is not in our sweet spot. So when we look at the markets out there, and we look at the physical facts on the ground, what can we say about southern forests and the future implications for timberland owners? So here's a few examples of what we look at when we're looking at the marketplace. Because when I think about Bob App's talk earlier, so much of the implications for private markets are about local implications across space and over time. So one example is when we think about the South, we think about its role in the overall economy. And one of the most important product classes in our industry is the saw timber product class, which is one where we had questions about what's saw timber doing. It drives so many supply models. When we run scenarios, we're often working with Bob Apt and using the CERTS model. We're a SOFAC member, and when we look at that, we need a base, a starting place. So here's our picture of the United States when it comes to saw timber. One is that 95% of the lumber that we use in the United States comes from 3 places. It comes from the Pacific Northwest, it comes from Canada, and it comes from the South. So this is like brass tacks, starting assumptions, how it is. It's what's happening. Now, when you think about those 3 places, those are 3 big places. And those are 3 big places that all have forest supply issues or opportunities. So let's go one by one. You go to the West. In the 1990s, the Pacific Northwest was the #1 source of softwood lumber to U.S. markets. That means they produced more lumber than Canada did to us, and they produced more lumber than the South. And what happened? We had the spotted owl, and we blocked off public lands. And what we did is we took the biggest engine of lumber production in the country, and overnight, through legislation, we put it in a box, because we essentially whacked off the public forests. Now, that's not a judgment. That's not a forecast. That's a fact. That's what happened. We had a market that would produce 20 billion board feet a year, and now it can produce at best 14 or 15 billion board feet a year. So is that going to change? I don't know if it's going to change or not. We're not going to forecast legislation, but all we can say is that no matter what the industry wants to do out there, from a supply side, it's a supply constraint. There's nothing else to it. It's in a box because it relies on what's available from private landowners. And those private landowners represent 40% of the forest out there, not 90% like they do in the South. The Pacific Northwest is in a box, supply. Then you go to Canada, we have a mountain pine beetle, a big issue. Canada's in a box. This is a country that from the late 90s to the mid 2000s was our #1 source of softwood lumber. So when the Pacific Northwest put themselves in a box, the leadership went to Canada. We were importing tons of lumber during this time, during our housing peak. What happened? They had a mountain pine beetle epidemic, and we had a recession. And in our work, it's about knowing the facts on the ground. So what's the exercise that we go through? So every quarter, twice a year, 4 times a year, we're out there confirming every single wood-using facility in North America. That's how we spend our time. We spend more time on that exercise than any other little thing. It's the confirming the facts on the ground. So if I'm on a road trip somewhere, I check in with the office and we look at the map and Brookes, can you drive by Clarendon and confirm that the OSB plant is running? Can you drive by Selma Pellets and confirm that they shut down? Can you drive by? And we have people laying their eyes on, and we do it in Canada, and we do it in the West, and we do it in the Lake States, because it's the physical facts on the ground that dictate the starting point for any scenario or any model that we build. And just like if you're doing that kind of due diligence, here's one thing I've learned. I've learned, first of all, that if you're trying to look at a facility or go look at a project that's closed, like we have to keep up with a lot of sawmills that are closed. During the recession, a lot of places closed down. So if I'm on a road trip and there's a closed Georgia Pacific mill in some random town, so I'll drive by the facility and I'll stop and I'll look. And I look and see, first of all, are the lights on? Is there a guard at the gate? If there is a guard at the gate, I'm going to get out of my car and talk to him. I say him because it's always been a him. And every time I've done this. So I go to the gate and I say, hey, how's it going? What's going on here? And we'll talk for 5 minutes. And he'll say, there's cobwebs, nothing going on. There's two things I always want to know. I want to know, is there a maintenance crew on site? If there is, it means somebody's keeping the site warm. And I want to know, do they have power? And so those two things, if they have power, it's much faster to crank up a sawmill or any facility if they still have their power hooked up. If someone's not really serious, they shut the power down, because then you're paying bills that you don't need. And the thing about security guards is, especially at sawmills, is they're lonely. They will talk to you, sometimes longer than you want. So that's the kind of due diligence, confirming those facts on the ground. So same exercise for Canada. What's Canada's story? Canada's story is that 10 years ago, this was a country, as a country, they had the ability to produce about 38 billion board feet of lumber. So those numbers don't mean anything. What matters is the change. Because if you go to Canada today, they can barely get to 30 billion. And why is that? It's sawmills closed. Why? Because of forest supply. It's all forest supply because they're still closing. We lost another 250 million board foot mill in British Columbia the first quarter of this year. And we always match mills to where the forests are. Spatial, super basic. Put the mills on a map, look at where the forests are, look at where the roads are. They're going to lose 2 to 4 more mills in the next year or two, just because the trees that are available to them are too far away from the mills that they have. And so that puts Canada in a box. And the other thing people forget about Canada is Canada has people, and they build houses, and they live in them, and they build their houses out of wood. So no matter how much wood Canada cranks up, the first customer is themselves. So you got to take 10 to 12 billion board feet right off the top and use it for their own homes, and some goes to China and the balance comes to us. And what that means is, just like the Northwest, Canada can never send us the volumes that they did in the past because they simply don't have the physical facts on the ground, the physical capacity, even if they wanted to. Even if they sent us everything they produced, they'd barely get to the numbers in the past. So Canada is also in a box. So these are these two giant engines of forest industry production and markets in the past, this is all the past 25 years, that now have been reduced because of forest supply issues. And then you come to the U.S. South, which has been the topic today. So since 2006, the U.S. South has been the #1 source of softwood lumber in the United States. Since 2006. Think about that timing. Right? So we had this massive housing market. We peaked in 2005, 2006. Between 2006 and 2009, our housing market, it collapsed. It fell by 3/4. It fell by 74%. That's what happened. Since 2009 and last year, we've grown that market by about 112%. That's an 11% annual compounded rate. So we've more than doubled our housing starts in the past 6-7 years. And we've increased our lumber production by about 50%. And prices between 2009 and 2016, saw timber prices, have fallen. So this is what makes my shoe phone ring. This is the call. The bat phone rings. Why the F are prices falling when housing is up and lumber is up and the models are bad, and what are our valuations doing? So this is right. This is the psychology of the private market. This is what's happening. It's not a good or a bad. It's just what is. What really matters to a private sector participant, to a market, to a mill or a timberland owner or to someone. It's what affects my wood flows and my cash flows. And that time frame is a little bit shorter than a forest rotation. It's what affects my revenues and prices, or my costs and the price of the wood that I have to buy to run my mill. So again, that's just what it is. That's just how it works, and so really understanding what's affecting those costs and prices is what we're looking at. So when you look at the US South, the West is in a box, Canada is in a box, and the US South has more wood than it has had since the Indians, right? Since the country was founded. And we are really good at growing wood. So what are the things that we track? We really care about supply, and we care about it across the continent. And supply story part one is the West and Canada. You have two regions that are in boxes. Supply story part two is the US South. We are pumping wood like nobody's business. And for us, number three is when you really think about technology and the implications of that and how it affects the private sector. So technology has two sides to it. You have the tree growing side and you have the wood using side. So that story I just told you about supply is about absolute volume. It's about mountains of wood in one part of the country, and it's about shrinking forests in two other parts of the continent. But technology is about relative supply. It's about relative supply. So on the tree growing side, we're really good at growing wood. We have some of the experts in the world in this room at growing trees in the US South. Right? And we're adding 1 or 2% a year every single year. We have great genetics. We fertilize, all this stuff we're really, really good at. So we're growing a ton of volume and we're growing it faster. So that's one piece of the story. The other side of the story, though, is the wood using side. And this is important, right? Because if we need less wood to do the same thing, we, in effect, have even more supply than we think we have. So what can a sawmill do? If you look 25 or 30 years ago in the US South, on average, it took a sawmill in our part of the country 5.5 to 6 tons of wood to produce 1,000 board feet of lumber. Today, it takes an average sawmill 4.5 tons, 1,000, to produce 1,000 board feet of lumber. So we are on the order of 20% more efficient. So think about that. We're growing more wood and faster than we ever have. In fact, and it's compounding because it's growth on top of growth during a recessionary period. And we're improving our ability to use less wood to get the same amount of product. So that spread is growing, right, between what you need and what you're growing. And both effects are compounding. Now, it's a catch-22. Of course, the flip side of that is, as a result, the West is in a box, Canada is in a box, is that the US South has in effect been a magnet for investment. So where's our office? Our office is in Watkinsville, Georgia. Why is it in the South? Because that's where the work is. Who's the guy they say, why do you rob the banks? That's because it's where the money is. So you're either going to, in our industry, you're either going to work in the South or the Northwest. There's a lot of work in other places, but 95% of the volume of lumber in our country comes from the South, the West, and Canada. Those are where the 3 best places to work in our industry. So what's happening here? So you've got this story of mills coming to the South. And this has been foretold for decades. It's not like this is new information. This is like guys in Canada who said, man, we got mountain pine beetle. We are in trouble. What are we going to do? Let's go to the South. That's where the wood is. And if you look at the US South today, 3 of the 5 largest producers of lumber are Canadian firms. It's Canfor, Interfor, and West Fraser. And when did they start moving to the South? They started moving to the South in 2006. So this is not a new, 11. That means what that really means is, if you've ever been on the due diligence side of making big investments, that means they were thinking about this 15 years ago. Because it takes a certain number of years to check it out and do your homework and figure out where you're going to move. So they actually started buying mills in the South 2006, and now they're here. And I shouldn't say they, because now they're sort of part of the team. If you talk to some of these firms, they're very sophisticated operators. They hired all the U.S. guys. Wood procurement is totally different in the South than it is in Canada, and they readily hired those teams. So they didn't bring a bunch of Canadian operators down, but they're really good at running sawmills, and that's what they've done. And what that has done is Canadian owners have been very efficient operators of mills, and all that has done is accelerated the improvements in technologies in mills. So again, that relative supply has grown. So when we talk to folks who are on these shorter time frames for investments, and when I say shorter, I'm thinking 3, 5, or even 10 years, we have a story where these mills saw how good it's going to be in the South, and they're down here now taking advantage of that. And an advantage, I don't mean that that's an agnostic statement. That is, they're making a lot of money because they believe that's where their business can be profitable and sustainable. They want sustainable profits, that's their goal. And sustainable profits in our sector is tied to sustainable supplies. That relationship exists. So what's remarkable to me is when you look at how things changed across the continent, we're running models for carbon or even growth models where we're looking at 30, 50, or 90 years. But think about what happened in North America in 25 years. In 25 years, we went from the Pacific Northwest being the dominant producer of lumber to getting whacked by a quarter, then that role being shifted to Canada 10 years later, and then they've been whacked by 20%, and since 2006, that's happened in the South. And so what's remarkable to me from a forest supply side is you can see that big changes in forest supply result in big changes in the industry, but also you can see how big changes in the industry have a relationship to forest supply. Because when we talk to these guys and they go, how sure are you about the South being sustainable for long periods of time, we just look at the facts on the ground. We look at the planting history, we look at the growth rates, we look at the technology, and we say, boy, here's 25 different places you could put a mill and be in business for the rest of our lifetimes. And that provides a lot of security to them. But the other thing it does is ultimately it provides a lot of demand in our region. And when Bob was showing those scenarios about scenario growing in our part of the country, so we're in that business. We have to count the mills one by one every quarter. Are they open? How much wood are they using? What are they going to be doing next? We get to things where, like, in 2 years, the U.S. South is, first of all, going to produce more lumber than it ever has in its history, but it's going to do it using less wood. And then 3 years after that, we're going to blow through any historical record of total volume production, and then we're going to start to get to a point where we start to move the needle on demand. But because we're so good at growing wood, it just stretches that timeline out, which is good for one side of the table and requires patience on the other. I want to close by telling one more story, because I love my work. I love forestry. I got into the business because, first of all, I really care about forest sustainability, and I think that a lot of it, especially where you're in a market that has a lot of private property rights, is about helping businesses make sustainable business decisions. And when Bob was here, we were talking about how we've had the chance to talk to firms or organizations where they want to do something, and we both said, that's fine, but that's not sustainable. You're better off doing it over there. And most firms, most clients, that's what they want to do. They don't want to create a problem, they want to solve one. So there's a guy that I used to work with. I mentioned I interviewed with this guy, Hal Cogburn. He's the 50%, 99% guy. So I got a job at Weyerhaeuser, and my first job was I was a scaler and a sorter out in Cosmopolis, Washington. And then I worked at a logging camp. And at that logging camp, there was a guy named Bob Schlesser. He was the truck boss. So that means he was in charge of telling all the truck drivers where to go on company lands, from harvest jobs to company mills on Weyerhaeuser property. And Bob Schlesser, like most guys at this logging camp who were supervisors, had not gone to college. So this was one of my first jobs. I'm college boy, right? And so every morning we show up about 5 a.m. and Bob would say, hey Brookes, come over here. So that everybody stops working because they want to see what Bob's going to tell a college boy. So he'd go, Brookes, you went to college, right? I'd say, yes, sir, I went to college. He goes, how does lightning work? I'd say, Bob, I don't know how lightning works. And he would explain it to me. Turns out Bob was a big reader. So big reader. He had driven log trucks 2 million miles. And in his job, he had the company mic, but between sessions on the company mic, he was reading books. He was reading popular mechanics. He was reading science. He was reading everything. I didn't know. Bob, he explained to me. A few days later, Brookes, come over here. Yes, sir. How does a flintlock rifle work? You went to college, right? Yes, sir. You know a flintlock rifle works? No, sir, I don't know how a flintlock rifle works. then he would explain it to me. So what did he do? So he did a couple things. First is he had to tear me down a little bit, right? So he's breaking me in, right? Just, I'm college boy, he's not. And so he did that. The other thing he did is he made it safe to work with me. Because when you drop a random college kid in a work situation like that, you need a bridge, right? So he provided that bridge, but it took two to tango. One is he had to do what he needed to do, and it was my job to be respectful. And so what he did is he made it safe for me to have a lot of colleagues in a work environment where we all had totally different backgrounds. And we ended up working together for about a year, and it was through that process that we all helped each other and we learned a lot of different things. And this theme came up today during the presentations. This made me think of Bob is we were talking about how many colleagues there are in the room and how one of the objectives of the PINEMAP program was to build relationships and get information out with it and engage. The word was engage. And it makes me think of Bob because I can tell that story in a mean way and I can tell that story in a nice way. But Bob did it in a mean way. It was intimidating the first time he did it. But once you realized you didn't want to hurt your feelings, there was a lot of benefit and strength that we got out of that. And so the things I got from Bob was he reinforced that importance of working with other people. He really reinforced how important it is to understand how things actually work on the ground. How does a flintlock rifle work? How does a skidder work? How does a chainsaw work? We went through everything. How does this log truck work? And he taught me a lot, and it was through those things that he helped me build that habit of, well, when I hear that, I really want to know, is that really how it works? And if we can confirm to the extent that it's possible that point A, that's really how point A works, we can have a little more confidence that our scenarios and our planning associated with point B and point F and point Z when we do our projections are going to be a little closer to reality. I'm going to close it there. I welcome any questions, and I thank you for the opportunity to share some comments with you.
I'll give you one.
Yeah, Mark.
One of the things I love that your group does is I call it the smell meter on bioenergy plants. Can you talk about that relative to checking things on the ground and how that came about? I mean,
yes, sir.
It's so brilliant, simply brilliant.
I appreciate it. It's simple. I mean, I think one thing we've learned is like if you're systematic and consistent about checking something, that's really how you learn, because you can build a history and then you can back check it. So we had this, our business started in 2004, and about 2006 and 7, we started getting a lot of questions about bioenergy plants, because they really affect timber investors, especially during a crappy housing market. People are like, what else can I do with my trees? Oh, we've got these 12 bioenergy projects opening in my area. This is going to save us. And this is also partly of how Bob and I got to know each other, was because he was getting a lot of energy requests. So we didn't have a process to assess whether or not a bioenergy project was going to be viable. We had to take a position on it. So what we did is we said, let's start tracking all wood-using bioenergy projects we started with the South, and then we did the whole country. And we do this every quarter to this day, so we've been doing it for 10 years. So when there's an announced wood bioenergy project, there's usually a press release. People are excited, or we hear about it, and we write it down. And then we write down what we know about it. What kind of technology are they going to use? Where are they located? And some details. And we apply a screen to this project. And we ask two very simple, basic questions. Question number one is, does the project use a technology that has been proven at commercial scale? That's it. So that has been proven at commercial scale. So why was this an important question? It was important because we used to have a lot of cellulosic ethanol projects announced, liquid fuel projects. And to this day, there is not an operational commercial scale cellulosic ethanol project operating on the planet.
No, not true.
Commercial scale.
Yeah.
At full run.
Yeah.
Who?
UPM committee.
Yeah, but they're not cellulosic ethanol. They're not serving that end market.
It's coming from it's a co-product, I agree.
Yeah.
It is coming from a cellulose source.
Yeah,
as opposed to a food source.
So this will be something I got to look at. Now, I'm going to take Gary's information because we're familiar with this project. It currently doesn't pass our screen, but now we'll go look. So this is an important part of the process, so thank you. So as of last year, There wasn't one of these, but this is important. So this is,
2 million gallons a year of renewable diesel.
yeah, so diesel is we set aside. So cellulosic ethanol is what can replace gasoline. It's got to be a 1-for-1 in cars, just like ethanol. Yeah, so that's why this one is set aside. And this is important because we had a lot of projects like this that were announced, and they represented a lot of wood use, and they got a lot of public funds. And so when we have a project that's cellulosic ethanol, when we have torrefied biomass, we have a couple others, if that project has that kind of technology, it fails the screen and we set it aside and we tell everybody we think it's going to fail. The other thing we do is on all other projects, pellet, power, combined heat and power, we have a 7-point checklist. Basic stuff. Do they have financing? Do they have a site? Do they have a wood supply agreement? Do they have a customer? Have they signed a contract for engineering, so the EPC contract or a takeoff agreement? And all we do is we require that we can verify 2 of the 7, which is a really, really low hurdle rate. And if we can't verify 2 of the 7, they fail the test. So right now we're tracking 439 operating and announced wood-using bioenergy projects in the United States. And right now, 140 of them fail the test. And it's a pretty low hurdle. Again, we've been doing this for 10 years, and so we back test. Every quarter we turn around and go, how do we do? And what we found, and because we get a lot of grief over this. I give in talks and they go, that means you think our project's gonna fail? And I always say, I say, Gary, it's not personal. I say, just call me and we'll come confirm that you're running, and when you are, we'll flip the switch, right? And what we found is when we back test, that we've actually been too optimistic. And this is the most conservative screen out there, that not only do projects consistently fail, they take longer than they say they're going to do. And so that's because we take them at their word on their timeline. There have been reasons for that. It's not all their fault. Part of it was the recession. A lot of guys lost financing. Part of it was cheap natural gas prices. So the projects weren't economic anymore. Again, not their fault, but just the reality. But it was that process of, and I appreciate that comment, is we go through this exercise every quarter. Those of you who know Amanda Lang, she leads that research for us. For those of you who know Amanda really well, she had her second child 2 Mondays ago and is on maternity leave. And they're doing well. And she's been an important part of that process. Yeah, so thanks for that question.
Second child is boy.
What's that?
Second child is boy.
Second child is a boy, Clay. Yeah, Puneet, thank you. Yes, sir.
Do you think the Sun paper mill will fail?
No.
You don't think so?
No, we don't. So, and I know that's in your market. You're in Broken Bow. Yeah, so we're pretty down on Sun paper. So this is a Chinese financed 6 million ton a year incoming wood in southwest Arkansas, massive pulp mill. So the quick story is that we stay really close to that project. They've been sniffing around since 2001, 2002. They've got it courted by the governor, et cetera, 2006, 2007. Just now got some of their permit applications in. We talk to the economic development guys every quarter, and they're pissed, they're irritated. We've talked to other pulp and paper companies. Believe it or not, there are other, people say there'll never be another pulp mill in the United States. They're wrong, there will be. We talk to companies that the technology is too good, and where's it gonna be? It's gonna be in the South. Why? Because we have too much wood, and it's cheap. And we have it's a good place to do business, and you can the infrastructure is good, and so we're familiar with 2 other firms, one directly that is looking at that market that would love to get in front of Sun Paper, and so something will happen there. I'm pessimistic that it's going to be Sun Paper because they haven't proven over time the ability to move their project forward. And we use a very similar screen that we did for energy. We just permits, financing, it's just the basic checklist that we just, every quarter we look at that list, we call the state and we ask them directly, and so it could happen, but based on this screen, it's low probability and could be somebody else. Yeah. Yes, sir, Gary.
What do you think the biggest impact will be from the Canadian side of infusing into the South? Yeah,
so, well, I tell you, so the question is, so the effect of the guys who have already come to the South. I'll tell you what, we've had a chance to talk to some of those guys, and I'll tell you what's really impressive about, one thing if you talk to some Canadian operators versus US operators, first of all, the cultures are different. but they're very sawmill oriented. And our experience has been when you talk to them, they move fast. And once they know there's enough wood, for them it's all about getting the mill up and running and being efficient. And the three firms that are the big ones, because there's more than three in the South now, their cultures are pretty different, so the personalities of the firms are quite different if you talk to them. But for me, they're bringing just a lot of good technology to the South. They seem to be treating their people pretty well. We always are curious about that kind of stuff, so that's been good. But they're bringing just a lot of expertise. When we see their investments, we expect the investments to be there for a really long time. These are not fly-by-night. And we've had those in bioenergy. These are not them. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So we heard a little bit ago from Tom Fox that good genetic material isn't going to be enough if we're not fertilizing.
Yeah.
But three of us participated in a meeting in Canada on Friday, and we were told that at least on public lands, they are very opposed to fertilizing.
Yeah.
So is that part of the box?
Yeah, so what that does is it slows down their ability to grow out of the hole, right? That's what it does. And I was in Canada a few weeks ago as well, and so that's what, because they've reduced their allowable cut again this year. That we watch two things now on Canada's ability. We look a little bit at Eastern Canada because they didn't get hit by the mountain pine beetle. So we look at does Eastern Canada is kind of cranking up a little bit, but there's limits. The other thing we do is we actually look at forest management practices in the South. We're super interested in this. Every 2 years we do a big survey of large forest landowners. So we did it last year. We had 17 million acres covered in the survey, because what we want to know is we hear people are fertilizing and planting and using different seedlings. So we've had a chance to talk about that today. But we want to know, we want to hear it straight from them. And all the survey work that we're able confirms all this. Everybody is moving up the chain on genetics. Everybody is fertilizing, almost everybody. It varies a little bit across the region, but we have a lot of detailed information on survival rates and trees per acre. And so the South, a lot of landowners, they're committed. And we had the question earlier today about land acres converting out of the system or out of forest to the South. I also sort of said, again, physical facts, what's possible? What are the physical facts on the ground and what's possible with respect to change? And so if you take the South as a bucket and we harvest 1 or 2% of our acres a year, that's the solution set of people who could even think about converting out. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but those are the candidates for making the decision not to replant. And of that 1 to 2%, the people who are going to decide not to replant is really, really tiny. And so anything that happens in terms of planting patterns is going to be super, super on the margin, incremental over time. A big natural disaster would change things a little bit. Yes, sir.
I like your emphasis on knowing what we can know.
Yeah.
That's comforting. But what keeps you up at night in terms of what might put us in the box?
Yeah. I worry, there's a couple things I worry about. We track certification pretty closely. And so again, I want to be agnostic on it because I grew up in operations. That's where my career started. So best management practices, responsible forest management, sustainability, that's why we're in the business. We have done studies where we compare different certification regimes and how they affect landowner decisions and the way end-use companies sometimes require. And I think there's unintended consequences in that business. So that's one thing that I worry about a little bit. I worry about trade policy. So even though the tariff with Canada and softwood lumber basically is, in my view, immaterial to what's going to happen in the industry, because again, the West is in a box, Canada's in a box, the South is going to get all the incremental volume, so the tariff becomes, it's a shell game for money. It's not a shell game for volume, because the volume is going to be in the South. But I do worry about trade policy, again, creating some unintended consequences with what a responsible business owner or forest manager might do with their land. So I think about those legislative things. Yep. Yes, sir.
Brooks,
Yeah, Bill.
do you work much with, say, timberland valuations and NCREF? And if so,
Yeah.
my concern is, do you have any thoughts on QE2 and the $4 trillion the Fed's got when they quit rolling that stuff over, and what it's going to do with interest rates, and return expectations?
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question. There's a lot of layers in that. I'm going
Pick one.
to do the same thing Bob did, which is answer the question that I can answer, that's a good strategy. So NACREIF, what Bill's referencing is the National Council of Real Estate Investment Fiduciaries. They produce these indices of real estate values every quarter, and they do it for Timberland. And they've been doing it for about 25 years. The time series goes back into the 80s, something like that, so it's maybe 20 years. And it's been a really important index because when you have a third-party index and a benchmark, it provides investors it provides the sector with some credibility, and it provides a benchmark. All right. So the thing about this NACREIF index is it comes out every quarter and it tracks institutional timberland acres in the United States. About 13 million acres are in that index. And it gives you values, and those values have been going up over time with a little dip during the recession, but it's been pretty steady, and it gives people some security. So I'm reading into the question a little bit, but since the valuations have been going up there and almost nowhere else over this long period of time, people are wondering, are timberlands overvalued? Right? So we're super interested in this question, partly because over time, when people value these assets, they have to use a discount rate. And these discount rates have been going down and down and down over time, which means that when you have a lower discount rate, you get a higher value. And if interest rates start going up, it implies discount rates should go up, which then gives you lower values. So we are watching this. So what's the issue here? We've got two levers on this. We actually have three levers. Lever one is discount rates. If nothing changes and discount rates go up, values go down. If if nothing changes but prices go up, values have room to increase. If nothing changes but volume goes up, values also have the ability to increase. So for me, I worry less about timber prices, which is what I know everyone cares about a lot. I really care about cash flow per acre. That's how I spend my time. When I look at values, we're so good at growing wood, right? There was a trade-off. More supply often leads to lower prices. We're so good at growing wood, and we grow it faster. What I want to know is, what I ask is, well, what are you getting cash flow per acre? Because it's P times Q. It's price times volume. Higher price, lower volume, lower price. If you get the same cash flow, the value should be the same. And so that's what I'm watching. I want to know, that's why for me, it's demand is the key. Because if we don't pull the demand through the system, most of your scenarios are down. But if we pull more volume through the system, we have stories and scenarios that either provide some stability or provide a little bit of upside. So that's how I think about it. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah. Mr. Welker.
Export markets for certain kinds of products.
Yeah, so for logs or lumber?
Lumber mainly.
Lumber, yeah. So questions about exporting softwood lumber in the U.S. South. So that's been a growing market. The Caribbean, for me, one of my favorite facts about exporting lumber in the South is that it doesn't all come from us, but the Caribbean, they get 1 billion board feet a year of softwood lumber. And I was like, dude, how can that set of islands use 1 billion board feet a year? But it's because all the houses get blown down every year. And so, in a way, right? There's a lot of rebuilding going on every single year in the Caribbean. So, not to be too flip about it, but that's again the physical facts on the ground. So that's a solid market, and then the issue for me is what's our ability to send to other markets? We do have a little bit of lumber going to Africa. We have a little bit going to South America, but for us, it's not a big growth market. The key for us is domestic. We can push a little bit of volume out the ports, and that's helpful in those local markets, and it provides a little bit of tension. But at the end of the day, if we don't build houses, we can't make up for that loss through exports. Now I got challenged on that with the Panama Canal, right? So actually 3 years ago, we went down to Panama. We checked out the canal, and we wanted to see this. You got to lay your eyes on it. So I'm hearing about the canal. It's going to solve all these problems. In the scheme of things, plane tickets are cheap. So you get on a plane, you go down, you check it out. So right now, Panama Canal, it's finally opening up. We had a Panama Canal that's been too small for the biggest ships that are shipping product around the world. And now the expansion of the Panama Canal has taken 3 years, 4 years too long. And they're opening it up. And in fact, it's so late that now there are ships that are too big to fit through the new Panama Canal. And we went down, and here's what I learned from that trip, and also looking at the research of product, our ability, does it help us ship more product to Asia, is that's a two-way street. You know, first of all, the economics are not that much better. It actually takes longer to send something through the Panama Canal from Asia to the south or back and forth than it does to do something through the port in Los Angeles. But it helps. It smooths it out, but it's not a no-brainer. But the real issue is that not only does it open it up to us sending stuff out, it actually looks like there's a better chance we're going to be taking in more product from other markets via the Panama Canal because Asia is going to be shipping us more manufactured goods. The trade-off on that is China's growing and they're using a lot more of their own product. And so one of the triggers that we look at when we look at different markets is how's the middle class doing? So we look at it like a Brazil or you look at a China, when their middle class is growing, they export less and they use more. And when they export less, it makes us more self-sufficient. And so that becomes the trade-off. Logs, we don't worry about from the south too much. We do look at those, but that's another story, not a lot of volume. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, Paneet.
How do you see the markets in Japan and South Korea for pellets?
Yeah, so this is sort of the new horizon. On the bioenergy market, sort of the UK has played itself out. We sort of know what the story is and what the upside and downside is there. And Asia is growing as a potential market for pellets. We don't know. We're looking at it. Like we're starting to track it. The way we're going to do it the same way we did the UK and the EU, which is, you know, there were projections at what time that Europe was going to use 50 million tons of pellets a year, and it's really going to end up being like 25, 30. So we're getting projections on Asia, but here's what we do. Again, just count. It's just math. It's just addition and subtraction, right? This is elementary school math. So what we do is we look at Asia and we go, what are the facilities that are going to use pellets? Put a name on them. Is it the Mitsubishi Project S or is it the, you know? And so until we have, and then we look at those projects and we look at how much pellets could they use, and then we start to add them up. So right now we don't have numbers like that. We don't have hard projects. And when we have hard projects, we'll start to add them up. But there are people in the Northwest looking at sources of fiber. So we do see that.
Okay, one final question.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary. No, we're good. It's good. It's all about hydrating. I really appreciate the questions and the conversation, the back and forth. We read PINEMAP's work. Sean and I, Sean Baker, who's on our team, we were talking about it this morning and yesterday. And so we're a consumer of the research, and we cite it, and we really appreciate what you're doing. So thank you for letting me be a part of it today.
Well, thanks, Brooks.
Yep. Yep.
We're not in a huge hurry. Please mingle.
Yeah, there's plenty of beer. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
We'll send you.